Chapter 23. How should I greet thee? The German diplomatist took Cecil in to dinner, and she found herself seated a very long way from Major Gordon, who was quite hidden from her by a barrier of hothouse flowers, crystallized fruits, and oxidized silver candelabra. There was a little interval in the drawing-room after the long, elaborate banquet, during which Flo and the rest of the amateur performers disappeared from the horizon. There were constant arrivals of people who came from short distances to assist at the private theatricals, and the room filled rapidly in this interregnum. And in all the time, Major Gordon and Cecil O'Boinville happened to be at different ends of the long room, almost as far apart as they had been, with the overland journey between them, Cecil thought, as she caught glimpses of the familiar figure now and then at the end of a long vista. There was rather a longer interval than had been anticipated, and Mr. Lobbyer, lounging in his favourite attitude against one of the mantelpieces, looked at his watch more than once, with a disagreeable sneer upon his face. 10:30, he said, and these amateurs were to have begun at 10. I suppose Evershed has lost his boots, or his memory, at the last moment, or my wife has set fire to her wig, or the machinery of the curtains is found to be unmanageable, or there is something agreeable of that kind in the wind. I never knew people make fools of themselves in this way that they didn't come to grief in some manner. But Mr. Lobia's forebodings were not realized. The door was flung open presently, and a solemn butler announced that the performance was about to commence, whereupon there was considerable rejoicing and some little bustle. The German diplomatist again presented himself to Cecil, and escorted by that gentleman, she made her way to the billiard-room, where, in the confusion attendant on the placing of some 50 or 60 people, she had little time to notice who occupied the seat next her. It was only when the rustling of silk and fluttering of tulle, the whispering and exclaiming, the questioning and answering, and entreating and refusing, and all the polite squabbling was over, and everyone fairly settled, that Cecil glanced towards the person on her right hand. Her heart had been beating at an abnormal pace all the evening, but perhaps it beat a little faster when she perceived that her right-hand neighbour was Major Gordon. They were to be seated side by side during the performance of a 5-act comedy, for 2 hours at least, so near that when he moved his arm in unfolding his perfumed programme, he stirred the airy puffings of her dress. As yet he was, or appeared to be, unconscious of her presence, and was listening deferentially to Miss Evershed's animated discourse. For though that young lady was apt to express herself very strongly in reprobation of the husband-hunting propensities of other girls, she was renowned as one of the most desperate flirts in the county. Cecil found herself wondering that Hector Gordon should be there, listening to the foolish talk of a light-hearted coquette, when it was only 9 or 10 months since the current of his life had been overshadowed by sorrow and death. His manner was graver and more subdued than of old, it is true, but still he was there, amidst that scene of foolish gaiety, while his young wife's grave was not yet a year old. The bandmaster waved his baton while Cecil was thinking this, and the band began the overture to the Bronze Horse. It was in the midst of this lively music that Hector Gordon turned and met the eyes of the woman he had once asked to be his wife. They saluted each other as ceremoniously as if they faintly remembered having met once before at a ball or a morning concert or somewhere. Cecil had been paler than usual from the early part of that evening, and on first seeing the Scotchman she had observed that the old warm glow of colour had vanished from his bearded face. If she fancied for a moment that he grew paler as he looked at her, it was only a foolish fancy, which she dismissed in the next instant. "How do you do, Lady Cecil O'Boinville?" he said, with just the faintest emphasis on the surname. "How do you do, Major Gordon?" Cecil would have been terribly perplexed had she been called upon to say anything more, but amidst the brazen prancings of the Bronze Horse, this was about as much as could be said. The bandmaster flourished his baton in a kind of frenzy as he urged his men to the climax. The cornets and trombones blew themselves into convulsions, and with a brilliant volley of chords, short and sharp as file-firing, the crimson velvet curtains swept apart, revealing a bijou chamber which Vestris herself might have envied. It was a boudoir hung with white satin and furnished with chairs and sofas and tiny fragile tables of white wood that were miracles of the upholsterer's art. On tables and cabinets there were vases of Sèvres biscuit filled with white exotics. Everything in the gem-like chamber was white. It was the virginal nest of a Parisian aristocrat of the old regime, such a nest as one might find nowadays in the Champs-Élysées or the Rue Taitbout, occupied by a different tenant. The comedy was called En accord à qui persévère, and was one of those airy fabrics which can only be constructed by the light hand of a Gallic workman. The Comtesse de Prélès is lovely, rich, aristocratic, a widow, and 22. For her, the universe is the sunniest and most delightful affair. She revels in her beauty, her wealth, her youth, her freedom. But so many charms are accompanied with certain penalties. The Countess is persecuted by the crowd of her adorers, and at last, in order to escape their importunities, in very despair, she accepts the addresses of the Duc d'Auberive, a gentleman of 40 years, bien sonné, stiff, grand, all that there is of the most patrician, a man whose ancestors have made their own terms with the kings of France, a man whose great-grandfather's arrogance would have defied the throne had it not been strangled by the iron hand of a Richelieu. Affianced to this gentleman, whom she respects but does not love, Léonie de Prélès is tranquil. Her lovers can no longer molest her. The name of the Duc d'Auberive will serve as an aegis, before which the most presumptuous of these superants must retire abashed. No, not the most presumptuous. There is the Marquis, the most utter scapegrace amongst them all, the man whose case was of all others most hopeless, le dernier des derniers, the rejected of the rejected, poor, out at elbows, morally, not actually, for he makes his creditors dress him handsomely in spite of themselves, dissipated, reckless, a man who has squandered an enormous fortune at Lansquenet and has lampooned the Pompadour, a man who at any moment may be consigned to the darkest underground cell in the Bastille to finish his worthless life in the society of rats and spiders. And this man dares to pursue the lovely Countess with his insolent importunities. He dares even more. He tells her that she shall marry him. Yes, though he is poor and worthless and a scapegrace, though he has lost all his money at Lansquenet, though she has affianced herself to that respectable idiot, the Duke. He loves her. Is not that enough? As to the fortune he has lost, a bagatelle. For her sake he will win another fortune. As for the fury of the Pompadour, he defies the Pompadour. For Léonie's sake he will do anything that is desperate, save the king's life when it has not been in peril, discover the details of a great political plot that has never existed, do something to win the favour of the monarch himself, in spite of the Pompadour. It is in vain that the Countess would banish this insolent. She denies him her door, he comes in at the window. She gives her servants the most severe orders, instant dismissal for the renegade who admits the Marquise. But in spite of her, the rejected wretch is perpetually at her feet. She triumphs in the thought of having outwitted him, and the next moment he is there by her side. She sends for her milliner, and lo, her milliner is the Marquis. She orders a cup of chocolate, and the lackey who brings it is the Marquis. She summons one of her gardeners to complain of the poverty of her exotics, and the gardener is transformed into the Marquis. And in all this there are involved those exquisite complications, that delicious équivoque of which Scribe was so great a master. Every moment there is some fresh situation, some new and delightful perplexity. Now the Marquis is hiding behind a screen, now dipping his powdered head up and down behind an ottoman. The Duke is always being fooled more or less, and the Countess is forced into deceptions she abhors by the artifices of her impertinent suitor. And with the fabulous good luck of all these fascinating scapegraces of the Parisian drama, the Marquis triumphs over every difficulty. All that he has promised to do in jest, he is able to achieve in earnest, without effort, for the trump cards of fortune drop into his hands. He does save the king's life in a hunting party almost by accident. He does discover a real political conspiracy, and again almost by accident. The king is delighted with him. The Pompadour forgives him. The forfeited lands of an ancestor are restored to him. A Jew miser, who has begged of him and whom he has assisted, dies and leaves him millions. And at last, tormented beyond all measure, the Countess yields. The Duke retires, glad to be out of a contest which is altogether unfamiliar to his stateliness, and the Marquis triumphs. Such a piece as this seems written to be acted in a drawing-room. There is no declamation, there are no heroics. Nothing is wanted but coquettish grace in the women, ease and assurance in the men. And who can imagine anything more delightful than Florence Lobier in the role of the persecuted countess? Such bewitching insolence of the grande dame, such fascinating hauteur, such delicious grace in refusing, such lovely tenderness in the moment of relenting. And the pompadour dress, that most perfect of all fashions ever invented to render loveliness irresistible, that costume in which plebeian beauty loses its alloy of vulgar clay and is sublimated into the ideal, that bewildering and bewitching attire which imparts to the snub-nose of a Dunbury a grace unsurpassed by the classic profile of a Phryne. What of Florence Lobier in blue brocade and old point, powder and diamonds, patches and hoop, high-heeled shoes with glittering buckles and gold-embroidered stockings? If Mr. Lobier had chosen his wife because she was the best thing to be had in the way of wives, he had good reason to be proud of her tonight, when she flashed her beauty and her diamonds upon the dazzled eyes of his guests. He was proud of her, after his own sullen fashion, and angry with her too, for another man shared the applause which she won and made himself the central feature in the night's triumph. It was not of Mr. Lobier's wealth or the glories of Pevenshall, the oxidized silver candelabra and epergnes, the looking-glass plateau with its border of silver bulrushes and silver stags drinking in the placid stream. It was not of the splendor of Mr. Lobier's dinner table or the cost of Mr. Lobier's modern pictures that these people would talk when they went home. The event of the evening was the amateur acting which the master of Pevenshall stigmatized as tomfoolery, and the triumphs of the evening belonged to Florence and Sir Nugent. Lolling in his luxurious chair and staring at the brilliant little stage with a moody countenance, Mr. Lobier reflected upon many things, the thought of which was scarcely adapted to the scene in which he found himself. Ah, if at some delightful assembly, where everyone is looking so pleased and happy, one could take the roofs off people's brains, as Asmodeus lifted the tiles and timbers of Madrid, what strange subjects we should find our friends pondering. There would be Smith thinking of that iniquitous lawsuit in which the villainy of some pettifogging attorney has involved him. Brown calculating the amounts of renewed accommodation bills, which must so soon be renewed again. Mrs. Jones thinking what a brute Jones has been for the last week, and how shamefully he is flirting with that brazen-faced Mrs. Smith. Thompson brooding over the gloom of the stock exchange and the amount of capital he has squandered on contango. And yet the dalliance and the wit go on all the while. Mrs. Brown sings one of her pretty sentimental songs, Robin Adair, or John Anderson, my Joe, while her feelings towards Brown are almost murderous. Smith warbles his little French chanson, all about laissons rire and un beau sourire, and is thinking of what he should like to do to the lawyer even as he warbles. O sublime hypocrisies of social intercourse! Is sadder of mutton very often cold? Salmon, whose attendant cucumber comes too late? Ice pudding, dissolving languidly on the napkin that envelopes it? Are the cates and confections of a modern dinner worth so much deception? Instead of the stereotyped invitation prepared by a fashionable stationer, why do not our friends write to us, saying, "Come, let us weep and howl together, for sorrows are many, and life is bitter"? Leaning back in his chair and looking at the stage, where the Marquise in violet velvet and gold was coquetting with the Countess in blue brocade and diamonds, Thomas Lobier's thoughts went back to an unforgotten time, and he saw a grassy angle, shut in by ivy-covered walls, and heard the clamorous voices of a crowd of boys. He felt a shower of blows sent home by a practised arm, the hot breath of an antagonist upon his cheek, a handsome face pressing closer and closer to his own. He felt all this, and the vengeful fury of that moment came back to him, intensified by certain feelings that had influenced him of late. He makes himself at home in my house, thought the millionaire. He gives his orders to the upholsterers. I'll warrant, though they'll send their bills to me. He chooses the piece that is to be played. He secures the services of the band, and I know that he hates me, and he knows that I hate him. And yet we smirk and grin at each other like a couple of clowns at a fair. If that knife had struck nearer home and had done for him altogether, it couldn't have been much worse for me than it was. I dare say I should only have had a 12 months' imprisonment or so, and I shouldn't have had him turning up on my wedding tour and taking possession of my house. The comedy came to an end at last. It had seemed very long to Cecil. The German diplomatist had talked to her between the acts, and Major Gordon had talked to Miss Evershed. After the comedy, there was an adjournment to the dining room for a stand-up supper, one of those suppers which admit of such ravages in stealthy middle-aged devourers who prowl from table to table and from sideboard to buffet, sipping of one sweet and then flying to the rest, consuming unknown quantities of white soup and lobster salad, taking now a 7 and 6 penny peach, now a plate of plover's eggs embedded in savoury jelly, pausing here to quaff sparkling hock, and lingering there to imbibe dry champagne. Such a supper-room affords a superb platform for flirtation, and the young ladies staying in the house and the young lady visitors of the evening did considerable execution among the plungers recently returned from the pale beauties of Hindustan and ready to fall victims to the rosy brightness of fresh young British belles. Cecil saw that Hector Gordon was graver and more subdued than his brother officers, but she saw also that he talked to Miss Evershed very much as he had talked to herself in the first days of their acquaintance at Fortinbras, and that he was undisturbed by any memory of the past. She felt that she had reason to be very glad of this. Any apparent consciousness of that brief romance by the seashore on his part must have been unspeakably painful to her now. And yet, she felt at the same time that Hector Gordon's calm indifference did not give her so much pleasure as it should have done. The close of the evening was very brilliant. The band of the plungers adjourned to the great conservatory opening out of the drawing-room after having supped luxuriously, so luxuriously indeed that one of the cornet players bungled considerably in the process of changing his keys and was severely reprimanded by his chief. But the Pevenshall guests were too deep in flirtation and pleasure to be aware of any transient hitch in the harmony of that delicious plunger band, which played waltzes and gallops to perfection, and the effect of the red coats and glittering brazen instruments seen athwart the dusky foliage of palm and orange, citron and cactus was picturesque in the extreme. Foremost among the waltzers were Florence in her pompadour dress, and Sir Nugent in his violet velvet coat and diamond-hilted rapier, and the German diplomatist watching them observed to Cecil that it was evident the baronet had learned to waltz upon the other side of the Alps. Conspicuous on account of her position as mistress of the house, doubly conspicuous because of her beauty and brilliant costume, Mrs. Lobbyer could not indulge in the mildest flirtation without incurring a certain degree of observation, and her flirtation with Sir Nugent tonight was not of the mildest order. It seemed as if he could not quite put off his character of the scapegrace adorer while he still wore the dress. As he had pursued the lovely countess in the comedy, so he pursued the bewitching Mrs. Lobbyer, now that the comedy was over. As Flo had coquetted in her role of the countess, so she coquetted now. Fast young squires remarked to their intimates that the pretty little woman was going the pace. Dowagers regarded Mrs. Lobbyer curiously through double eyeglasses. Even Miss Evershed shrugged her shoulders and told her confidant of the moment that the flirtation was really becoming a little too glaring. "I shall speak to Nugent about it tomorrow," she said, "for I think he minds me as much as he does anyone, and as I know she is a good little thing, with no real harm in her, I don't like to see her make a fool of herself." It was nearly 4 o'clock when the last carriage rolled away from beneath the Italian portico. It was quite 4 o'clock when Florence went upstairs with Cecil. Now half to the setting moon are gone, and half to the rising day, low on the sand, and loud on the stone, the last wheel echoes away, exclaimed Mrs. Lobbyer, whose gaiety throughout the evening had been of a very feverish order. "Let me come to your room, Cecil. We'll have some strong tea and talk over our evening. Do you think it has been successful?" The two ladies were on the threshold of Cecil's room as Florence asked this question. They went into the luxurious little retreat where the fire and candles were always burning as brightly as if they had been watched by some genius of comfort rather than by an ordinary attendant. Mrs. Lobbyer rang for tea, and then, after flinging herself into one of the low chairs, pulled off her powdered wig with its superstructure of plumes and diamonds. "Oh, how my head aches!" she exclaimed as she loosened her hair and let it fall in a shower upon her shoulders. "I wonder whether real actresses ever feel as I have felt tonight. Do you know that I had a splitting headache before dinner and that my brain has been throbbing like a steam engine all the evening? Just put your hand upon my head." Cecil laid her fingers gently upon the fair young head, which was burning with fever. She brought eau de cologne from the adjoining room and bathed her friend's forehead. Mrs. Lobbyer's maid appeared while Cecil was doing this. "Let us have some strong green tea, Martin," said Flo, "and bring me a dressing gown. I want to get rid of this horrible dress." The maid retired to give her order and returned almost immediately with a loose garment of white cashmere and quilted satin. She took to pieces the brilliant pompadour toilette, the diamonds and lace and bouquets and plumes, and removed the useless litter, leaving her mistress wrapped in the dressing gown, with her fair hair falling about her face and neck. She lay back in her luxurious chair in a listless attitude, looking dreamily at the fire, and did not speak until some little time after the tea service had been brought. "You are sure that you are not sleepy, Cecil, and that I am not making myself a nuisance?" she said at last. "Quite sure, dear. Shall I pour you out some tea?" "If you please, only it isn't fair that you should wait upon me. You have so much more reason to be tired than I have." "But I am not in the least tired," exclaimed Flo. "I am only preternaturally awake. And now tell me, Cecil, do you think my evening has been a success?" "I think people enjoyed themselves extremely." "That is no answer, Cecil." "And I think you acted charmingly. Indeed, everyone thought so. But—" "Ah, there it is. I expected the but. What is it, Cecil?" "Am I to be candid, Florrie? You know I love you very sincerely, dear, and I want our friendship to be something more than the conventional friendliness of women who praise each other's dresses and bonnets. Am I to speak without reserve?" "Oh, yes, if you please," answered Flo, with a sigh of resignation. "I have been doing something dreadful, I suppose." "I think you know what I am going to say as well as I do, Florence." "Perhaps I do, but you shall say it notwithstanding. What is it?" "You remember what we talked of this afternoon. I told you that I thought your manner with Sir Nugent Evershed was a little different from your manner with other people, and apt to invite observation on that account. I tell you frankly, Florence, that your manner and his manner tonight did attract observation, and that some of your guests spoke of you as they had no right to speak. People are very incautious in a crowded room, and one hears things that are not intended to be heard." To Cecil's surprise, her friend burst into a laugh, a clear, silvery peal of laughter, which would have been charming if it had not been in such strange discord with the occasion. "And so people have begun to talk of me," she said. "I dare say they have talked enough of Mr. Lobbyer and Mr. Raymond, and now I suppose they will talk of me and Sir Nugent Evershed." "Florence, for heaven's sake, don't talk like that. How would you have me talk? Am I to submit tamely to my wrongs? If my husband outrages me, I will outrage him. Why, those ignorant country people could give me the clue to Mr. Lobyer's indifference. They know that my husband devotes his life to another woman and has only married me because he wants someone to sit at the head of his table who does not smoke or swear or paint herself red and white, like Mr. Raymond. He likes the smoking and the swearing and the red and white paint, you know, and I have no doubt he thinks me a horribly insipid creature. But society is not yet so advanced that he can afford to place a Mr. Raymond at the head of his table. That will come in due course." "Florence, you must not speak of things in this way. I know, dear, that your position is a most painful one, and I can only think of one thing that you can do to lessen its misery." "And what is that?" "Write to your father, telling him everything, or beg him to come to you. He is the only person you can safely trust with the secret you have so unhappily discovered." "Secret?" cried Flo bitterly. "A secret that is known to all the countryside. No, Cecil, your advice is very good, I dare say, but it is advice that I can never act upon. I have made a mistake, but I made it with my eyes open, and I will never tell my father how miserably my folly has come home to me. He gave his consent to my marriage with such reluctance. He knew that I was selling myself for fine clothes and a splendid establishment, but I tried to deceive him. I tried to deceive myself. Modern London is a kind of maelstrom, Cecil, and my poor foolish head was giddy with all that confusion of carriages and horses and bric-a-brac and jewellery. Everybody is so rich nowadays, and one is stifled with the wealth of other people. I had begun to think that life was intolerable without $1 million of money some time before I met Mr. Lobia. He was the first millionaire who crossed my path, and I accepted him blindly, but I thought that he asked me to be his wife because he loved me, Cecil, honestly, after his own unromantic fashion, and I meant to do my duty to him. I did indeed, Cecil." "I believe it, darling, and you may still do your duty," answered Cecil, bending tenderly over the slight figure. Mrs. Lobbier had slipped from the low chair to the ground and was half sitting, half kneeling at her friend's feet. "What, with a Mr. Raymond in the background? Never, Cecil. Besides, I had long given over that idea of doing my duty. Within a week of my marriage, I discovered how mistaken I had been in thinking Mr. Lobia cared for me. It was for his own glorification, the gratification of his own vanity, that he married me, and I am not so much to him as his horses or his dogs, for he takes some pleasure in their society. He swore at me before our honeymoon was over, because I ventured to remonstrate with him for his brutality to a waiter who had made some mistake about the arrangements of the dinner. From that time, all thought of doing my duty honestly and conscientiously, as I had meant to do it, was over. Our marriage was reduced to the level of a bargain, and I resolved to perform my part of the bargain as fairly as I could. So I dressed to the best of my ability, and I receive my husband's friends, and am civil even to those Manchester people, and I fill up invitation cards, and give the housekeeper her orders, and discuss the arrangements of the house. Who is to have the blue room, and who is to have the chintz room, and who we may venture to put upon the second floor, and so on. With regard to Sir Nugent Evershed, I will frankly confess that he is an unutterable relief to me after Manchester, and if I flirt with him a little now and then, I consider myself quite at liberty to do so. Tonight my nerves were irritated by the rencontre of the afternoon, and I dare say I behaved very foolishly. I wanted to demonstrate my defiance of my husband. I wished to show these people, who no doubt know all about Mr. Raymond, I wished them to see that I was no sentimental wife devoted to an unfaithful husband. But, my dearest Florence, was it wise to sacrifice your own self-respect in order to gratify your pride? I have no self-respect. I have never respected myself since I married Mr. Lobia. Oh, Cecil, there is nothing that has ever been written about such marriages too strong or too bitter for their iniquity. We sell ourselves like slaves, and when the bargain is completed, we hate the master who has bought us. Don't kiss me, Cecil. I am not worthy that any good woman's lips should touch mine. I have sold myself to a man whom I despised before I hated him, and now that it is too late, I repent of my wickedness. But if Mr. Lobia outrages you by association with such a woman as that person we saw today, you may be released from this unhappy union. You have only to appeal to your father, Florence. Surely he can help you. Yes, he can take me back to the fountains, to be the laughing-stock of everybody who ever knew me before my marriage. Ah, how the manoeuvring mothers and husband-hunting daughters would triumph if they could discover that my brilliant match had ended in failure and misery. No, Cecil, I must abide by the bargain I have made for myself, and, after all, I cannot complain that I am cheated. I sold myself for diamonds and carriages and horses and servants, and Mr. Lobia has given them to me. I told you it would be a bad thing for me when I came to talk seriously of things. I must take life lightly, Cecil, like other women who marry for money, and now parlons toilette. Tell me how you like my dress tonight. Is that blue a good candlelight colour? I had awful doubts on the subject. If there were any green tinges in it, I must have looked hideous. After this, Cecil tried in vain to bring her friend back to anything like serious conversation. Mrs. Lobbyer chattered as gaily as if no sorrow had ever shadowed her life, and the dim winter daylight glimmered coldly behind the rose-tinted curtains before Cecil could induce her to retire. They separated at last, however, after kissing each other affectionately, and Florence Lobbyer's grand field night came to a close. After the amateur theatricals, there was a little lull at Pevenshaw. Mrs. Lobbyer kept her room for a day or two, attended constantly by Lady Cecil O'Boinville. Medical wisdom pronounced that she had over-fatigued herself and ordered extreme quiet. But to endure such a regimen as the doctor prescribed for more than 48 hours was quite beyond Florence's patience. On the evening of the second day, she reappeared in the drawing-room, paler than usual, and all the more fascinating by reason of that delicate pallor. Pevenshaw was besieged by callers during that particular week, people who had been so delighted and so charmed and so surprised by the amateur comedy, and who were eager to testify their gratification and their delight to the mistress of the mansion. Amongst these callers were the officers of the plungers, and amongst the officers came Major Gordon. He came one bright frosty morning when a bevy of ladies, headed by Miss Evershed, had sailed off to the billiard-room, and when the group in the drawing-room was a very small one. The sentimental widow sat by the fire reading a new French novel, the philosophy of which she took the trouble to expound now and then for the benefit of her companions. An elderly dowager dozed over the morning paper. Mrs. Lobbyer sat at a little table by one of the windows, trifling with her brushes, before a half-finished watercolour sketch of a group of Camellia japonicas that had been brought from the conservatory for the gratification of a sudden artistic impulse on the part of the mistress of Pevenshaw, and Cecil bent over an elaborately embroidered slipper, which she was preparing for the great O'Boinville. "I think it would be rather nice if I could only get a bird's nest," said Flo, after a lengthened contemplation of her sketch. "Camellia japonicas and a bird's nest. Mrs. Lobbyer. That would look very well in a catalogue, wouldn't it? But I suppose birds' nests are out of season in January. People talk about money being able to buy anything, and yet I dare say my picture will be a failure for want of a bird's nest. Camellia japonicas by themselves are so uninteresting, and I did so want to astonish Papa by sending something to the British Institution just to show him that I hadn't neglected my painting. What do you think of a cut lemon, Cecil? One of those big clumsy lemons one sees in old pictures with the rind trailing from it. Or what would you say to a silver salver, or one of Mr. Lobyer's great chase tankards, or a Sèvres vase? I positively must have something to relieve the insipidity of my Camellia japonicas." While Mrs. Lobbyer was debating this important subject, Major Gordon was announced. Cecil and Florence were seated very near each other, and after shaking hands with both ladies, the soldier took the chair nearest his hostess. Then for the first time Cecil felt the extreme embarrassment of her position. The man who had once loved her approached her as a stranger, and yet, in spite of her prayers, in spite of her struggles to hold firmly to the right, the vision of the past came back to her, and she thought of him, not as she saw him now, courteously indifferent, conventionally polite, but as she had seen him on that last day at Fortinbras, with his head bent and his eyes dim with tears. But with him it was otherwise, thought Cecil. Surely if any recollection of that time had been present to his mind, he could not have seemed so entirely at his ease. He inquired about his aunt. He had not seen her since his return to England, and he was very anxious to see her, dear soul, he said. She was visiting, of course, always visiting at this time of year. He had received delightful letters from her and invitations to some of the houses at which she was staying. "If I can get away from Chiverley for a week, I shall run over to Thornley Grange, in Leicestershire, where she is to be in March," he said. "But at the worst, I shall see her in town, I suppose, early in the spring." This last remark seemed to require an answer, so Cecil replied that she had no doubt Mrs. Maclaver-House would return to Dorset Square in the spring. And after this the conversation became general. Florence told Major Gordon her difficulties with regard to the Camellia japonicas. "They will come out so stiffly," she said despondingly. "No one but a Miss Mutry or a Van Huysum could make anything out of them. Mr. Lobia came in from a morning's ride while the Scotchman was talking to the two ladies, and on this particular occasion Mr. Lobia happened to be in very good humour with himself and the world in general. The Chile Island loan, in which he was vitally interested, was beginning to look up in the market, after having been for some time in bad odour, and the influence of a rapid advance of 7/8 brightened the millionaire's countenance. He made himself as agreeable as it was in him to be, and invited the Major to dinner the next day, when some other fellows were coming from Manchester. The Major hesitated just a little before he accepted the invitation, and it seemed to Mrs. Lobya that he glanced towards Cecil in that moment of hesitation, but he did accept it. "Why, Cecil, you never told me that Major Gordon was related to you," said Flo when that gentleman had departed. "He is not related to me. My aunt, Mrs. Maclaverhouse, is only his aunt-in-law. There is no real relationship even between Major Gordon and her whatever. There is no relationship between him and me." "Indeed, but you did not even tell me that you knew him. How very nice he is, and a young widower. I think there is nothing so interesting as a young widower. One generally associates a widower with baldness and stoutness and half a dozen children in rusty mourning, but a young widower is delightful. And he is, or is to be, very rich, is he not? Mr. Lobia says so, and he keeps a kind of mental register of other people's banking accounts. I wish there were no such person as Mr. O'Boynville." "Florence!" "Oh, I don't mean any unkindness towards him. But if you were only single, it would be so nice to make a match between you and the Major. Matchmaking is the natural occupation of a married woman, and I want an eligible couple to operate upon. Depend upon it, Mrs. Vancourt will set her cap at our Major." This was said sotto voce, for Mrs. Vancourt was the sentimental widow. The lady in question looked up from her book 5 minutes afterwards to expatiate upon a passage thereof. "Is not this true?" she said. "How well this man knows the human heart. Il n'y a jamais d'oubli où il y a eu de l'amour. Durant l'absence, on croit toujours oublier et on se trompe toujours. Mais lorsqu'on revoit celle qu'on a aimée, les années passées s'envolent comme le songe d'une nuit d'été, et on s'aperçoit qu'on n'a jamais cessé d'aimer." A faint blush spread itself over Cecil O'Boynville's face as the widow finished her lecture, for there seemed to her some grain of truth amidst the French romancer's flimsy sentimentality.
Chapter 24.
Between Carthage and Kensington. While the splendours and gaieties of Mr. Lobya's household afforded conversation for the neighbourhood of Pevenshaw, William Crawford the painter worked his hardest at a picture which he fondly hoped would be one of his best achievements. It was for this that he had declined his daughter's invitations. For this, and perhaps just a little, because the society of Mr. Lobya was distasteful to him, and the gorgeousness of the Lobya ménage stifling and oppressive. He had refreshed himself with a month's holiday during the past autumn, and had spent his holiday in Venice, the city of his love, the city to which he had taken flight after his first success, to rest for a while amid the dreamy beauty of the Adriatic, the poetic glories of the past. After his holiday he had returned to the fountains with a sketch for his new picture in his portfolio, a sketch that had been thought out and dreamed over as he lay back in his gondola, or basked, at full length, in some woody island, with pine trees murmuring above his head, and blue and emerald-tinted wavelets creeping to his feet. The union between the painter and his only child had never been a very close one, and although pretty, frivolous Florence was very dear to his heart, her marriage had not made any great break in his life. He looked forward to seeing her early in the spring, when a Tyburnian mansion, which Mr. Lobya had hired at a rental of something between 500 and 600 per annum, was to be furnished and fitted for the reception of its occupants, and in the meantime he was very happy alone in his painting room, with the grand old cedars making a solemn shade in his garden, and his big canvas on the monster easel under the northwest light. He was very happy, with ample leisure for his art, and alas for the weakness of earth's grandest spirit. There was one other passion besides his worship of art which absorbed the painter's mind in these quiet January days. Mrs. Champernowne had returned to the Hermitage before Christmas, and had been pleased to write a little note of inquiry about Mr. Crawford's labours, and had been pleased to welcome him graciously when he called in response to her note, and to bestow her sweetest smiles upon him whenever he chose to visit her. His visits to the Hermitage had been very frequent of late, and it seemed as if the fascinating Georgina could not see him too often. She talked of his art and of his own special triumphs that had been and were yet to be, with as much appearance of interest as if she had been his sister or his wife, for sisters are not always given to enthusiasm upon the subject of a brother's successes. She made him strong tea. She played Mozart to him. She ordered her niece to sing pretty little ballads for his pleasure. She spent a small fortune in the purchase of French and German photographs in order to have something new to show him whenever he came to the Hermitage, but in the presence of other people she always carefully avoided anything like empressment in her manner to the great painter. She is very cautious, he thought bitterly. It amuses her to indulge me as she indulges her cats. But if I were to tell her that I adore her, and that she has rendered my life a burden to me without her, she would elevate her eyebrows with the most innocent air of surprise, and demand what justification she had given me for my presumption. But in spite of this conviction, the painter was a constant visitor in that tranquil abode, where there was always a faint odour of hyacinth and myosotis, and a delicious atmosphere of repose not to be found elsewhere. Ah, if the lively matrons, the brilliant rattles, only knew the profound charm which a wise man finds in the companionship of a quiet woman. Mr. Crawford dined sometimes with the widow, who altered her old-fashioned hours and took her dinner at 7 to serve his convenience. The little dining-room at the Hermitage was very delightful to the painter, with its sombre colouring of grey and green, its few perfect bronzes, and 3 or 4 rare pictures, and instead of the glare of gas, the subdued light of half a dozen yellow wax candles in antique silver candlesticks. The widow's dinners were perfection on a small scale. Her wines were of the rarest and best, and above and beyond all this, she possessed the talent of bringing together people who suited one another. William Crawford abandoned himself entirely to the dangerous delights of this acquaintance. The cup which the siren's hand offered his thirsty lips contained a beverage which he knew to be poisonous, but he drank nevertheless, and grasped the fatal chalice with a feverish eagerness. He was in love, as entirely engulfed in the terrible ocean as the most ignorant plunger who ever leapt blindly to his doom in the stormy waves. He had allowed himself to drift imperceptibly down the stream, and it was only when the current had grown too strong for him that he discovered whither the cruel tide was hurrying him. And when the discovery came, it was too late to recede, too late to be wise. At the worst, she can only break my heart, thought the painter. And having a good deal of the laissez-aller in his composition, he gave himself up to the delights of the Hermitage, and shut his eyes upon the darksome vision of the future. He worked hard, but not so indefatigably as he would have worked if there had been no such person as Mrs. Champernowne in existence, not as he had worked in the Buckingham Street lodging in the days of his obscurity. The real artist should care for nothing but his art. This is the doctrine which William Crawford had preached and practiced for 15 years of his life. But in these latter days he was false to his own teaching and tried to serve 2 masters. The great canvas on his easel progressed slowly, and he began to look at it hopelessly as he thought how soon the fitful sunshines of April would steal upon him. A year sooner or later can make little difference to me, he thought, and yet I should like to have made my mark in the Academy this season. There are new men springing up, and I want the critics to see that my colour has not lost all its brilliancy since the days of the Aspasia. Throughout the progress of his picture, Mrs. Champernowne was his sympathizing and encouraging friend. She entered heart and soul into every subject connected with his work, all his ambitious hopes, his depressing fears. He trusted her entirely, laying bare all the weaknesses of genius, and confiding himself wholly to her mercy. He talked to her as he had never talked to man or woman in his life before, and perhaps she, in all the world, was the only creature who knew that Mr. William Crawford believed in his own genius. "I know how small I am, if you weigh me in the balance with the men of the past," he said. "Good heavens! Where did they get their power, those demigods of art? There is a head of Christ by Quentin Matsys in the museum at Antwerp, and the eyes that look at you out of the canvas are human eyes, dim with tears. There is a chasse in the hospital at Bruges, painted by Hemling, which you could look at for a year and find new wonders in it every year. And you remember Van Eyck's adoration of the Lamb, the crimsons and purples, all the brightness of summer in the green trees and winding blue rivers. The power to paint like that seems to have vanished off the face of the earth. And yet we love our art and work hard and do good things too, in our way. I wonder whether the men of the future will measure themselves against us, centuries after we are dead and gone, and talk despairingly of our power. I suppose every work of genius is sanctified by time, and that if Rubens lived in the next street, we should have plenty to say about the violence of his colour and the audacity of his foreshortening. What should we think of the pyramids if they had been built yesterday? We go into raptures about those great piles of stone because it is some thousands of years more or less since they were erected. But who ever talks of the monster hotels? And yet I think the monster hotels are quite as wonderful as the pyramids, and I should just as soon expect domestic comfort in the one as in the other. Depend upon it, Mrs. Champernowne, we are all just a little fooled by the past. If a man sent the Venus de Milo to Trafalgar Square tomorrow, there would be plenty of art critics ready to declare that her head was too large for her body or that her knees were afflicted with white swelling. Many times during that early spring did the siren plead for a glimpse of the picture, but on this point William Crawford was resolute, even to her. "What would you have thought of my Aspasia if you had seen her a month before she was finished?" he said, when the widow entreated for one peep at the Dido. The inexhaustible Aeneid had furnished the subject for the new picture. I assure you, there was a period in which she appeared in the last stage of intoxication. My model is a figurante at Drury Lane. Don't shrug your shoulders so contemptuously, Mrs. Champernowne. She's a very good little girl, though she does dance behind a row of footlights for a guinea a week, a girl with the face of an angel and the figure of a Dutch doll. I have to find my Dido her arms and shoulders between this and May, but if you will come to my painting room during the first week in April— "If I will come," cried the widow impatiently, "I have a good mind to make my way into your painting room some night like a burglar, and look at Dido and your Ennius by the light of a bull's-eye lantern, as they say Mr. Morlace painted his Queen of Lydia unrobing. I hope Ennius is handsome." "Oh, poor fellow, he is a professional model who has been handsome in his day, but whose beauty has succumbed beneath the influence of gin and water. My Aeneas shall take after his mother. I have been studying all the types of the Greek Aphrodite in order to find the head I want. I heartily despise that poor stupid Dido, and I have always detested Ennius," said the widow. "It is my belief that his piety was of the Pecksniffian order, and that he only carried his father in order that he might have an excuse for losing his wife. But I am dying to see your picture nevertheless, and I shall count the days between this and April." The days passed quickly enough, in spite of Mrs. Champernowne's impatience, and early in that capricious month the painter stood before his finished picture, waiting the widow's visit. He had been putting the last touches to the canvas during that very morning, and even now he had his palette in his hand, and hovered restlessly before his easel every now and then, as if he would fain have made some new attack upon Dido or her cruel lover. "If Mrs. Champernowne doesn't come directly, I shall do something dreadful to the Trojan's nose," he muttered, looking at the big clock. His nostrils are a thought too red, as it is. Another touch of vermilion, and he would look as if his nose had been bleeding. You are a lovely creature, Dido, though perhaps I have no right to say so. There are the wheels and the bell. She is coming, my love, my sweet. I hope they have arranged a nice luncheon. I'll go out and meet her." The painter laid down his palette and ran to the portico, beneath which Mrs. Champernowne appeared with her niece in attendance. Charming as she was always, she had never been more delightful than today, with her pretty air of impatience, her bewitching assumption of sisterly interest in the painter's triumph. "Take me straight to the painting room, please," she said, as Mr. Crawford moved towards the open door of the drawing-room. He obeyed her and led her at once to the big tapestried chamber where the perfume of jonquils and hyacinths blew in under the open window. The great picture stood opposite to the door, and Mrs. Champernowne sank silently into a low chair which the painter had placed for her at some little distance from the easel. It was a perfect feast of colour, a banquet of beauty. The painter had chosen for his subject the humiliation of the Carthaginian queen at the feet of her lover. Dido has heard of the Trojans' intended departure, and the first storm of passion has spent itself. She has come to implore him to remain. She came to reproach him for his cruelty, but love has been stronger than indignation, and in her tears and her passion she has fallen prostrate at his feet, her hands clasped, her eyes uplifted to his thoughtful face, her golden hair falling about her in a glittering shower, her regal mantle of white and gold streaming on the ground as she kneels. There are real tears in her blue eyes, so deep in their violet shadow, so brilliant in their light. You see the traces of tears that she has dashed away with an impassioned hand, still glittering on the golden fringe of her lashes, and in every articulation of the intertwined fingers, in the convulsive contraction of the lovely lips, the lines that wrinkle the ivory brow, you behold the evidences of her despair. William Crawford's Dido is no beautiful doll, but a living, breathing woman, sublimely lovely in her womanly anguish. Ennius, disturbed and compassionate, but still resolute, has only a secondary interest in the picture. He is listening and will speak presently, and you feel that he will be courteous and tender and gentlemanly in his answer to that fond, appealing creature. But the passion and the despair are Dido's, and the interest of the picture is hers. In every detail of his great work, William Crawford had shown himself a poet as well as a painter. The atmosphere was not of Kensington, but of Carthage. It was evening, and athwart barbaric pillars you saw the sun going redly down behind a waveless sea, while far above dim stars glimmered in an opal-tinted sky. A faint, languorous mist crept over the purple distance, but the foreground of the picture was one glow of gorgeous colour. The tessellated pavement on which the Queen of Carthage knelt was inlaid with mother-of-pearl and gold. Curtains of strangely mingled hues trailed from the cornices of the chamber, revealing glimpses of a wall covered with broad bands of black and red. The gaudy plumage of strange birds made a confusion of colour amidst the purple cushions of a low couch that filled a niche in the curtained wall, and the western sunlight was reflected redly on the water in a shallow basin of jasper and onyx, over the margin of which hung a woman's embroidered garment. The widow sat before the picture in perfect silence. There was no affectation in her love of art, and seated before the painter's work, she seemed unconscious of the painter's presence. But it was not so with her niece, who gave utterance to all those rapturous exclamations peculiar to persons of her sex and age. "Oh, how lovely, Mr. Crawford!" cried this young lady. "Your Dido is a most exquisite creature, and I am sure your picture will be the picture of the year. I had no idea the Carthaginian costume was so becoming, or that Carthaginians ever had that lovely golden hair. Isn't she beautiful, Aunt Georgina?" "Go and amuse yourself in Mr. Crawford's garden, Helen," Mrs. Champernowne exclaimed impatiently. "If I am to enjoy this picture, I must see it in peace. Your how lovelies and how beautifuls are most distracting. You are always going into raptures about hyacinths. You can look at Mr. Crawford's hyacinths and go into raptures about them." "I should very much like to see the garden," the young lady replied discreetly, and having received the painter's permission, she flitted away through the open window and disappeared in the trellised walk in which Philip Foley had nursed his despair. The widow sat for some minutes after her niece's departure, still silent, with her hands clasped in her lap and her eyes fixed on the canvas in solemn contemplation. At last she drew a long breath, a sigh of relief, as of one who had been held for a while breathless and spellbound, and then the painter ventured to speak to her. "Are you satisfied?" he asked nervously. She turned to look at him with eyes that were dim with tears. "It is great," she said, in a voice so subdued as to be almost a whisper. "It is worthy of you. I am proud of your triumph. I cannot tell you how proud I am." Never until that moment had he seen tears in the eyes of his siren. Never until that moment had he lost command of himself. Never until then had sober common sense failed to pluck him backward with a relentless hand when he faltered on the brink of folly. But the tears in Georgina Champernowne's eyes were too much for common sense. For the last 6 months, the painter had known that the moment must come sooner or later when his own rash hand would destroy the airy fabric of his folly. The fatal moment came today, and he was powerless to struggle against his destiny. He gave one furtive glance towards the garden, where Miss Vickery's light silk dress glanced hither and thither among the flower beds, and then he laid his hand on the back of the widow's chair and bent his head to speak to her. "Do you know how dangerous it is for you to speak to me like that?" he asked. "Dangerous? How or why dangerous?" She looked up at him with the very expression he had so often imagined, the pretty air of unconsciousness, in which there was neither displeasure nor alarm, only an innocent surprise. It seemed to him as if he had acted this scene 100 times before, and knew what the end was to be. So constantly had he acted it in his daydreams, so often had he imagined its bitter termination. Dangerous for you, trebly dangerous for me, because when you assume an interest in my work, a pride in my fame, you tempt me beyond my strength. You tempt me to say that which may make us strangers from the moment you leave this house today. My work and my fame are yours, yours to trample under your feet if you please, for you have only to tell me tomorrow that my art is distasteful to you, and I, who have been the slave of art for 25 laborious years, will never touch a brush again. You have been fatally kind to me during the past few months, Mrs. Champernowne. You have admitted me to a friendship which must embitter the remainder of my existence, unless you are prepared to make that existence unspeakably happy. You must have expected this, or something like this. You could not imagine that I could see you day after day and be with you week after week without loving you, as I do love you, as I think only a man of my age and of my concentrated life can love. The widow sat with her face turned away from the painter, her eyes fixed on his picture. The soft folds of her cashmere shawl were slightly stirred by her hurried breathing, but her attitude was statuesque as the attitude of Dido herself. "I am very sorry," she said softly. "Very, very sorry. Sorry that I love you. I am sorry that you should speak so seriously. How would you have me speak? How can you expect that I should be otherwise than serious? You must know that I love you. You must know that I have loved you ever since you first admitted me to your intimacy, ever since you first assumed a friendly interest in my career. Yours is too sympathetic a nature for the coquette's heartless ignorance. You could not have been unconscious of such love as mine. I never dreamt that you felt so deeply. If I fancied sometimes that you valued my friendship more, far more than it was worth, I thought you were only like some of my other friends, who are pleased to think better of me than I deserve to be thought of, friends who pay me pretty compliments whenever they come to see me, and forget my existence half an hour after they have left my house. Why should you be so much more in earnest than they? You are only equivocating with me, Mrs. Champernowne. You must have known that I was in earnest. I never thought about it. I knew that your society was very delightful to me, but I never for a moment imagined that such a friendship as ours could result in unhappiness to either of us. And why should our friendship have any such result? Why should I not continue to be interested in your career? Why should not you come to see me whenever you please? Is friendship impossible between a man and woman, even when both have bidden adieu to youth? Promise me that you will never again say the desperate kind of things you have been saying today, and I will promise to take pleasure in your society to my dying day. Why should we not be like Cowper and Mrs. Unwin? You are not mad, and I am not evangelical, but I think that is rather an advantage. Promise, Mr. Crawford, and let us be friends for ever and ever." She held out her hand, and the painter took it tenderly in both his own. Could he have refused to take that hand, even if it had held the sentence of his death? "I cannot make such a promise," he said gravely. "I love you too dearly to be your friend. There is not an hour I have spent in your society during the last 2 years in which I have not been on the brink of telling you what I have told you today." "Oh, but that is positively dreadful," cried the widow archly. "Friendship must be quite impossible if one's friends are always to be on the brink of saying desperate things." "Don't laugh at me, Mrs. Champernowne. My future life depends upon the answer you give me today. Against my own reason, against my own will, I have yielded myself up heart and soul to the fascination you exercise over me. I had not been in your house half a dozen times before I knew that if it was not my road to paradise, it was my road to perdition, and yet I came. I knew that you had money, high family, fashion, and that in your narrow world of the West End I should be laughed at for my presumption, if it was known that I hoped to win you for my wife. And yet I came. I was quite prepared for what has happened today. I never really hoped. I never in sober sadness believed that you would answer me otherwise than you have answered me. I only let myself drift. You asked me to come to you, and I came, and I should have gone on, crawling to your feet like a lapdog forever and ever, if the impulse of the moment had not been too strong for me today. Our friendship was very dear to me, answered Mrs. Champernowne. I am sorry that it must end. I am sorry that it should ever have begun, responded he painter passionately. Do you think a man has no more heart nor mind than one of your Angora cats? Do you think you can play with his heart for a year or two, and then give it back to him none the worse for your year's amusement, and tell him to take it somewhere else? You have no right to trifle with honest men as you have trifled with me. You have no right to encourage my folly for your own amusement, and then tell me that you never thought I was in earnest. You knew that I was in earnest, and it was because of my earnestness that you found me more amusing than your other admirers. Where they burned the conventional flame that passes in society for real fire, I consume my heart and soul. And now you affect unconsciousness. You offer me your friendship, the right to go on being miserable, the privilege of sacrificing my life and my heart for the sake of an occasional hour in your drawing room. You have been selfish and cruel, Mrs. Champernowne. He walked to the window, turning his back upon the siren. But the siren was not made angry by this discourtesy. She was sincerely sorry for his grief and his passion. It was the story of Dido and Aeneas over again. Only in this modern instance of the classic legend, it was the lady who was cool and clear-headed, and the gentleman who was passionate and unreasonable. The painter threw himself into a chair by the fireplace and sat with his elbow resting on the arm of the chair, his face hidden by his hand. Miss Vickery, who had been flitting restlessly about the garden, came towards the window at this moment, but the widow waved her back with a gesture which was unseen by William Crawford. He had been sitting in the same attitude for some minutes when his visitor came softly to the hearth and seated herself in the chair opposite to him. "Come, Mr. Crawford, let us talk seriously," she said. "I have been only too serious from first to last." "I believe that, and I am bound to speak frankly to you. You will think me very cold-hearted, very unwomanly, very selfish when I have spoken, but it is better that you should think of me as I really am. Let me first assure you that I truly value your friendship, and that I shall be heartily sorry if I cannot retain it. But I am selfish, and my present mode of life is so agreeable to me that I cannot bring myself to change it. You, who have been your own master always, free to follow your art, free to live your own life without question or hindrance, can scarcely imagine what a precious thing liberty is to anyone who has suffered a long slavery. I am not going to tell you any piteous story of my past life. It has been what people call a very fortunate and favored existence. But until I was 30 years of age, I never knew what it was to be my own mistress. Up to my 18th birthday, I was subject to the discipline of a convent. Very gentle, very wise, that discipline was. But every book I read, every letter I wrote, every country ramble or summer holiday, every garment I wore, was regulated and arranged for me by others. I left my convent school pining for freedom, and found myself subject to the guardianship of a very strict father and an uncompromising elder sister. In a 12-month, a visitor came. There was a little private discussion. I was summoned to my father's study one summer morning, and was told that my fate had been arranged for me, and that I had nothing to do but to thank Providence for my good fortune. 6 weeks afterwards, I married a man old enough to be my father, and began a new slavery. I had the best and kindest of masters, and my bondage ought not to have been very irksome to me, but it was bondage, and I thirsted for liberty. I ventured to hope that I did my duty. My husband thanked and blessed me on his deathbed in words whose memory is very tender and precious to me. Since his death, I have been free, and I have lived my own life. A very simple life, as you know, but oh, so delicious to me in its untrammeled ease. I read what books I like. I keep what hours I like. I choose my own friends. I abandon myself to every caprice of the moment. If I want to waste my time, I waste it, and there is no one to complain. If I want to throw away money, I throw it away with open hands, and there is no one to show me a long list of items in his banker's passbook. If I were seized tonight with a fancy for starting off to Naples, or Cairo, or Constantinople, or the Caucasus, I should tell my maid to pack a portmanteau and be off by the first train tomorrow morning. But a woman with a husband must employ the diplomacy of a Metternich to obtain a trip to Brighton. Many men have asked me to abandon this precious freedom, but I have never been so candid as I am with you today. I know you must despise me for my selfishness, but I hope you will try to forgive me. Accept me, if you can, for what I am worth, and continue to be my friend. I cannot continue to be that which I have never been, answered the painter sadly. I have never been your friend. I am inclined to think that friendship is only possible where anything beyond friendship is out of the question. I have always loved you, and I must go on loving you till the end of my life. I think it will be better for us both that all intimacy between us should end today. I thank you for your candor. There are some men, perhaps, who would go on hoping against hope, even after what you have said to me. But then, I have never really hoped. I spoke to you today because I was no longer able to keep silence, not because I thought that any good could come of what I had to say. There is one thing more that I am bound to speak of, and then I have done forever. I know that you are too generous to suspect me of being influenced in the smallest measure by the consideration of any worldly advantage to be derived from a union with you. But I am bound to tell you that had your answer been a different one, had it been the answer which I never hoped it would be, I should have religiously abstained from profiting in the most insignificant manner by any superiority of fortune which you may have over me. My art brings me 4 or 5 thousand a year, and would, I am told, bring me double that amount, if I cared to throw myself in the way of making larger gains. I feel myself compelled to tell you this, Mrs. Champernowne, for while there are fortune hunters in the world, honest men must defend themselves from the possibility of suspicion. I am sorry you should think it necessary to defend yourself where I am concerned. Forgive me for thinking it barely possible you might do me wrong. And you really like the Dido? There was a long pause between the two sentences. Mrs. Champernowne felt the full significance of that pause. She knew that in returning to the subject of his picture, the painter had made an end forever of that other subject, so much nearer to his heart. I think you have surpassed yourself, and I shall look forward with pride to your success. Surely you have seen enough of those hyacinths, Helen. You may come in and see the picture now, if you will promise to moderate your raptures. Thus appealed to, the young lady crossed the threshold of the window with as unconscious an air as if she had been quite unaware of anything peculiar in the interview between her aunt and the painter. She became straightway absorbed in the contemplation of Dido, while the widow arranged her bonnet strings before the cheval glass provided for the accommodation of the young persons who sat to Mr. Crawford. Mrs. Champernowne was some little time arranging her bonnet strings, and the face which the painter's furtive glance showed him, reflected in the glass, was very pale. "You will stop and take some luncheon," he said presently, when his visitors were leaving the painting room. "I have had it prepared for you." "You are very kind, but we dine at 4, and it is 3:30 now. 1,000 thanks for our private view, and goodbye." "Goodbye. I am coming to the carriage with you." When she was seated in her brougham, Mrs. Champernowne, for the second time, offered her hand to the painter, while the most discreet of nieces looked out of the opposite window. "Is it really to be goodbye?" she asked, as Mr. Crawford pressed the slender hand gently before releasing it. "Believe me, it is better so. I thank you much for your interest in my work. I shall be hoping to please you when I am painting for other people. Goodbye. And you are not angry with me? I have no right to be angry. What am I to tell your servant? This inquiry had relation to the most discreet of footmen who hovered in attendance, second only to the most discreet of nieces in his assumption of unconsciousness. Home, if you please, answered Mrs. Champernowne with a little sigh or vexation. The siren had entertained a special penchant for this particular victim, and she did not like to see him escape alive and whole from amongst the corpses floating in the dim shades of her fatal cavern. The most discreet of nieces found her aunt by no means easy to please during the rest of that day, and the favourite Angora cat, repulsed and discomfited, was fain to creep into his elegant lair of quilted satin and wickerwork. It is very hard that at 35 a woman cannot have a friend, thought the widow, as she pretended to doze by the hearth where the painter had so often found her in the dusky light, with her feet buried in the fleecy depths of the polar bear skin, and a faint glow from the fire glimmering here and there among the silken folds of her dress. It is really very hard, for I liked him so much. William Crawford watched the widow's brougham drive away, and then went slowly back to his painting room. He carried a weary spirit to the shrine of art, the great consoler, but today even the face of the serene goddess was darkened for him, as it had been years ago when his young wife's death left him desolate. He stopped before his picture for a few minutes, looking at it wonderingly, lost in admiration of his own work. I have painted that, he thought, and yet I am not happy. It was no impulse of vanity that prompted the thought. The artist would be something less than an artist if he did not recognize the beauty of his own creations. Even in this picture, to which he had given so much thought and labor, there were shortcomings which the painter's eye was quick to perceive. But he was proud of his finished work nevertheless, and he sat looking at it with a strange mixture of pride and sadness. I have nothing but my art now, he said. Nothing. Nothing. My daughter is a lady of fashion, too busy to spend a day in this quiet house. The woman I love is selfish and heartless. I have nothing but my art. Perhaps I ought to be very glad of that. I can make my painting room my pillar, and live in a solitude as complete as St. Simeon's stylites found in his uncomfortable elevation. You shall have a companion, Dido, before the year is done. Chapter 25. The Easy Descent. Mr. O'Boynville presented himself at Pevenshaw early in the month of February in response to Cecil's renewed entreaty that she might be allowed to return to her home and its duties. There was no small sacrifice involved in his tearing himself from the delights of the law courts even for a few days. But having once turned his back upon Westminster Hall, he abandoned himself freely to the pleasures of social intercourse. He was delighted with his wife's improved looks, and thanked Mrs. Lobbyer in his heartiest manner for the change which her influence had wrought. However closely I may stick to my work, you must never lead such a dreary life again, dear, he said. She never shall, cried Flo eagerly. We are coming to town in March. Mr. Lobbyer has taken a house in Mortimer Gardens, one of those new houses overlooking Hyde Park, and I mean to be tremendously gay. And Cecil must come to all my parties. Lady Cecil declared that the gaieties at Pevenshaw were sufficient to last her a 12-month, but neither Mr. O'Boynville nor Mrs. Lobbyer would hear of this, and there was a friendly compact concluded between them to the effect that Cecil was not to be permitted to bury herself alive in Brunswick Square during the ensuing season. Mr. O'Boynville spent 3 days at Pevenshaw, where he made himself as completely at home as it was his custom to make himself wherever he went. There was a dash of the Yankee in the character of the popular Hibernian, and it was not in him to be constrained or ill at ease by reason of any lurking doubts as to his own merits. Big and hearty and genial, he stood with his back against Mr. Lobbyer's own particular mantelpiece, and talked down the best of the clubmen and the grandest of the county squires, careless whom he pleased or whom he offended. Major Gordon dined at Pevenshaw on one of the 3 days, and Mr. O'Boynville attacked him on the subject of the late war. Always well posted in his Times, The barrister seemed to be as familiar with the Indian campaign as the man who had been through it. And how about that affair at Alacapuda, when Sir Tristram Belpier made his fellows put their lances under their left arms and job downwards as they rode over the enemy? That lying down of the Sikhs and firing after the charge was a clever move, but they got it hot that day. And what of Colonel Menkinson's tactics at Bundlebad? Was that charge of the light infantry a wise thing or not? Demanded Mr. O'Boinville. This sort of conversation went on all through the dinner. At first there was some slight reserve in the Major's manner to Lady Cecil's husband, but the ice melted little by little beneath the influence of Indian reminiscences, and before the evening ended, a friendly familiarity had arisen between the two men. The barrister begged that Major Gordon would make a point of visiting Brunswick Square whenever he found himself in London, and the Major responded with a vaguely polite acknowledgment which committed him to nothing. "You are a kind of relative of my wife's, you know," said Mr. O'Boinville, "and we ought to know more of each other." Very early in March, Mrs. Lobier's thoroughbred chestnuts and powdered footmen astonished the quiet inhabitants of Bloomsbury, and Cecil found herself seated by her friend's side in the Ladies' Mile. Whatever preference she might have had for the dull tranquillity of her own drawing-room, she was obliged to forego, for her husband and her friend conspired together in order to force her into the agreeable whirlpool of West End London. And then she was really attached to Flo. She was really anxious about this frivolous, unstable creature, surrounded by so many temptations, supported by so little moral strength. She was really concerned for the tranquillity of Mrs. Lobier's life, for Sir Nugent Evershed had taken possession of chambers in St. James's Street and was to be met very frequently at the new house in Mortimer Gardens, and where Florence Lobier was concerned, Sir Nugent and danger were associated in the mind of Lady Cecil. In the new Tyburnian mansion, all the glories of Pevenshall were repeated on a smaller scale. There were more encaustic tiles, more parquetry floors, more bronze and ormolu balustrades, more ceilings picked out in gold and colour, more monster Sèvres vases and tiger-skin rugs. The glittering freshness and brightness of the rooms had an oppressive effect upon the senses of people accustomed to ordinary dwellings. "There might be some hope for a parvenu if he could live long enough to wear the edge off his wealth," said one of the clubmen, after dining for the first time in Mortimer Gardens. "But the modern span of life does not give a millionaire time to overcome the appalling freshness of his possessions. He is like a working man in his Sunday clothes. The Sunday clothes are always new. In such a house as this, you see the stamp of the nouveau riche on every object, from the virgin gilding on the ceilings to the untarnished lacquer on the letter weights. Show me a man's carpets, and I will tell you the length of his pedigree. The Vieille Roche rarely indulges in fresh upholstery. At Lord Scamander's you can poke your cane through the carpet, and if anyone attempted to draw the window curtains, they would crumble into ashes, like the draperies of a house in Pompeii. Old Lady Teucer will have an action for damages brought against her some day, if she doesn't take up her stair carpets, for one runs the risk of breaking one's neck every time one calls on her. If I were a millionaire, I would watch the sales at Christie's and buy up all the dilapidated buhl cabinets and rotten tapestry in order that I might swear they had belonged to my great-grandfather. I wouldn't have an ounce of plate on my table of a later date than the reign of Queen Anne, or a sound carpet on my floors." Mr. Lobier was supremely indifferent as to what his guests might please to say or to think about him. In London, as in Yorkshire, the cares of the speculator had possession of him. That undying worm which torments the rich man, who never knows when he has made enough money and is always trying by every tortuous and darksome process to make more, had made its home in the breast of Mr. Lobier, and for such a man the frivolous pleasures which amuse ordinary people have very little attraction. In London, as in Yorkshire, Mr. Lobier had amusements of his own and companions of his own, and left his wife to amuse herself after her own fashion, and amongst whatever acquaintance she might choose for herself. For this helpless young creature, so lonely amidst so much splendour, so friendless amidst so many friends, Cecil felt unbounded compassion. "But what am I, that I should be any comfort or protection to her?" the barrister's wife thought sadly. "Who could be weaker than I was at the first sound of his voice? Who could cling more wickedly to the memory of the past than I have done since I have seen him? At her husband's wish, Lady Cecil went back amongst her old set. The season was a brilliant one, and she went out 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with her aunt, often with Mrs. Lobbyer, sometimes, but very seldom, with Mr. O'Boynville. He wished her to be gay and happy, and she obeyed him, at first with reluctance, but by and by with a guilty pleasure. The words which Ruth spoke to Naomi contained the epitome of a wife's duty, and Cecil had long abandoned all hope of doing her duty in such a spirit. Her husband's people were not her people, his home was not her home. If she had been suffered to go her own way, she would have observed the letter of her duty, and the spirit would perhaps have come to her in due time. But a kind of fatality seemed to pervade her life, and the hand which should have sustained her within the quiet precincts of her home pushed her, with well-intentioned ruthlessness, out into the world. Hector Gordon came to London in April, and Lady Cecil met him very often. There were so many places at which they were likely to meet, and they were constantly meeting, though the Major paid no visit in Brunswick Square, whereupon the barrister condemned him as a snob who did not care to risk his reputation by being seen in an unfashionable neighbourhood. Lady Cecil and Hector met very often. At first, the icy reserve with which they accosted each other seemed an insuperable barrier, not to be broken down or worn away, but little by little this freezing coldness of manner gave place to a gradual thaw. Some chance allusion to the past, to a book read at Fortinbras, the subject of some old argument worn threadbare in those idle autumn days, carried them back all at once to something of the old intimacy, as it had been before the storm cloud of passion disturbed the serenity of their friendship. Mrs. Claverhouse was delighted to have her nephew with her again, and he came to Dorset Square as he pleased. If by a series of coincidences he happened generally to be there when Lady Cecil was with her aunt, the dowager was too frivolous and too much absorbed by her own pleasures and her own interests to be alarmed by the fact. She was very fond of Hector, and she knew that his return to England had brought her many things which were dear to her heart. Besides his usual tribute of Indian shawls and ivory caskets, the Major made his aunt many substantial and useful offerings. He begged her to recruit her exhausted cellar from the stores of his wine merchant, and with his own pencil marked the choicer vintages in the merchant's catalogue. He presented the dowager with a stylish landau in place of the phantom chariot, and in divers manners enhanced that lady's comfort and respectability by his generosity. "He brings sunshine with him wherever he goes," said the incautious dowager. "And to think that he should be a widower, with all the girls in London setting their caps at him, I dare say. Oh, Cecil, Cecil, what a pity you were in such a hurry to marry that big blustering barrister." This was the most cruel blow which Mrs. Claverhouse had ever inflicted on her niece. Cecil's reproachful look smote her with some sense of shame. "Well, I know I encouraged Mr. O'Boynville," she said, "and of course he's a very excellent fellow and tolerably well off, only tolerably, as things go nowadays. But still, it is a pity, you know, Cecil. However, there is nobody to be blamed, for who could imagine that poor namby-pamby wife of Hector's was going to die?" "Auntie, you mustn't talk like that," Cecil answered hastily. "My husband is good and kind and generous-minded, and I am very happy with him." This last statement was false, and what is worse, the speaker knew it to be false, but she fancied that it was her duty to say it, nevertheless. Perhaps she had some faint hope that by force of repetition it would come in time to be true. At what point did the path in which she was treading swerve from its straight course and become a fatal and crooked way, leading she knew not whither? Lady Cecil never knew when her footsteps first strayed across the invisible borderline between right and wrong, but she did know that a time came when her eyes met her husband's honest glance with a gaze that was not altogether fearless, when a vague sense of remorse oppressed her in her husband's presence. Alas for that fatal whirlpool of West End life, those dangerous meetings on staircases and in conservatories, those idle mornings at horticultural fêtes, those sunny afternoons on racecourses, where the clamour of 500,000 voices drowns the insidious whisper of one voice for all but the too eager listener. and the chance encounters in the crowd, and the water parties, and the festal gatherings in shadowy gardens by the rippling river. Alas for all the machinery which the modern Mephistopheles finds made ready for his hand when he undertakes the perdition of any given victim. Before the season was over, Cecil and Hector had drifted back into the old companionship. No word had been uttered by the Major to which the most fiery of Hibernian husbands could have taken objection. But the friendship of a man and a woman who have at one period in their lives been something more than friends is very apt to be a dangerous friendship. In this whirlpool of West End life, Cecil had no time for self-examination, even if self-examination were a process to which the human mind is inclined. If she was doing wrong, if she had passed the impalpable boundary line, she shut her eyes to the fact and would not remember those hidden dangers towards which she was drifting. If the days on which she met Hector Gordon were very pleasant to her, she beguiled herself with the idea that her pleasure arose from other causes than the soldier's presence. What was he but an element in the crowd? And as a woman is not gifted with the faculty of logic, Cecil did not take the trouble to ask herself why the crowd seemed so dull and vapid without him. She could see Mrs. Lobia's danger, for that was a peril of a palpable and obvious nature. It is impossible for a young matron to indulge in a chronic flirtation with one of the most eligible single men of the season unnoticed and unslandered, but Flo did not object to being slandered a little. The furtive glances of dowagers and the whispers of faded beauties gave zest to her life. "It's no use talking to me, Cecil," she said, when her friend remonstrated with her. "You know that I care about as much for Sir Nugent Evershed as I care for this parasol, but it gives me tone to have him dancing attendance upon me. He brings me people whom Mr. Lobia's money would never beguile across my threshold, and I should be a lost creature without him. But if your father were to hear one malicious word about you, Flo—" "My dearest Cecil, that is just the kind of thing one's father never does hear. If I were to commit a murder tomorrow, I should like to know who would tell my father anything about it. Unless he read the affair in the newspapers, he might go down to his grave in happy ignorance of my iniquity. And after I had been hung, his acquaintance would shake their heads and say, 'That sad attack of bronchitis. So young, so lovely.' But I always told Mrs. Lobbier that the throat was the vulnerable part." And so on. Between Florence Lobbier and Major Gordon there arose a very cordial alliance. He, as well as Sir Nugent, had the power of bringing nice people to Mrs. Lobbier's house, and to surround herself with such people was now the supreme ambition of that lady's mind. All the substantial glories and grandeurs of this life, all the splendours that can be bought with money were hers, and she had now only to find eligible guests for her brilliant drawing-rooms, the last fashionable lions to roar at her crowded assemblies. Directly Aladdin has hung up his roc's egg, he begins to spread his lures for the elite of the city, and will be miserable if they remember his father's trade and are slow to attend his parties. All the best military men in London were known to Hector Gordon, and through his agency the heaviest of Marshall's swells were secured for Mrs. Lobbier's evenings. Her gratitude was boundless. Her dear Major Gordon could not come to Mortimer Gardens too often. "And you must come to Pevenshaw in September," she said. "I believe the woods swarm with hares and pheasants, if you care for that sort of thing, and you shall bring as many people as you like. And dear Mrs. McClaverhouse must come, and Cecil, of course. We shall not go on the continent this year. I couldn't go through another autumn of picture galleries and cathedrals without endangering the state of my brain." While Flo extended the circle of her acquaintance and vied with women of established position in the splendour and number of her entertainments, William Crawford went his quiet way and held himself aloof from the parvenu grandeurs of Mortimer Gardens. The Dido was an undisputed success, and Florence received the congratulations of her artistic acquaintance on her father's triumph. There was another success of the season, which she heard of with strangely mingled feelings of pleasure, pride, and shame, the achievement of a young landscape painter called Foley, whose Sunset on the Danube had raised him at once to no mean position in the ranks of young painters. Flo went to see the picture and thought a little sadly of her old adorer. there were two little bits by the same hand, hanging low down beneath larger subjects, and finding both these bits unsold on the day of the private view, Mrs. Lobbyer secured them for Pevenshaw. For some unknown reason, she did not choose that her own name should appear in the transaction, and commissioned Sir Nugent to buy the pictures. As the season advanced, Cecil spent less and less of her time in Bloomsbury. If she contrived to dine at home 3 or 4 times a week, her mornings were generally spent in some fashionable amusement, her evenings devoted to some fashionable assembly. Mrs. Lobbyer had her box on the grand tier at Covent Garden, and was never happy unless her dearest Cecil accompanied her to hear every new opera and to criticize every debut. So, when there were no other engagements, there was always the opera, and it seemed as if Cecil was never again to spend her evenings at home. What did it matter? Mr. O'Boynville had his after-dinner sleep and his papers, then his long evening in the seclusion of his study. He received his cups of tea from the respected Pupkin instead of from the white hands of his wife, and beyond this, Lady Cecil's absence or presence must have been the same to him. This is how Cecil reasoned when her conscience smote her on the subject of her perpetual gaieties. Of course, she was quite ignorant of that vague sense of satisfaction, that dim consciousness of a dear companionship, which the barrister had been wont to derive from his wife's presence even while he slept. And was not her husband always the first to urge her acceptance of every tempting invitation? "Enjoy yourself as much as you can while the season lasts, dear," he said, "and don't trouble yourself about me. In a few years I shall have made the future safe, and then you shall have a house at the West End, and I'll enjoy life with you." At the opera, Cecil almost always met Hector Gordon. He was one of the privileged visitors to Mrs. Lobbyer's box, and he availed himself of his privilege very frequently, not dropping in for a few minutes between the acts to murmur polite inanities, with his opera hat in his hand, but abandoning his stall altogether, and taking up his place behind Cecil's chair. One night, when Sir Nugent Evershed was in attendance upon Mrs. Lobbyer, and when the two were too much engaged by their own conversation to be observant of their companions, Hector Gordon spoke to Cecil for the first time of that unforgotten interview at Fortinbras. The frozen barrier that had separated them at first had long ago melted. A dangerous friendship had arisen between them, but as yet no fatal word, no actual transgression of the right had sullied Cecil's life. Her sin had been that she had wilfully shut her eyes to the perils of such a friendship, that she had obstinately refused to see the gulf towards the brink of which her footsteps were straying. She had loved him so dearly. Alas for her broken marriage vow, she loved him so dearly still, and his companionship was so sweet to her. She could not banish this charm from her life. This year, for the first time since those autumn days at Fortinbras, she had known entire happiness, dangerous happiness, fatal happiness perhaps, but that all-absorbing delight of the present, that brief intoxication of perfect joy which shuts out all thought of the future. If she had sinned unconsciously until tonight, she must henceforward sin with a full knowledge of her guiltiness. For tonight the flimsy veil of a pretended friendship was rent aside, and Hector Gordon spoke to her as he had no right to speak to another man's wife. The conversation arose out of one of those accidental commonplaces from which such conversations generally do arise. It began amidst the crash of a chorus in the Huguenots. The Major had been admiring Cecil's bouquet of white azaleas. As he bent over the flowers, he tried to draw one of the frail blossoms away from the rest, but Cecil took the bouquet from his hand. "You will spoil it," she said. "Those fragile flowers will not bear being disturbed." "And you refuse me even that? Do you know that I have not a shred of ribbon, a scrap of writing, a book, a flower, not the smallest object that has belonged to you?" She tried to look at him bravely, but the guilty throbbing of her heart told her how weak she was, and her eyelids fell under his gaze, the same gaze she remembered at Fortinbras, but with less mournfulness and more passion. "What of that?" she asked. "Why should you have anything of mine?" He did not answer her question, but continued in a tone of reproach. "And now that I want to take away some relic of tonight, perhaps the last night that I may ever spend in your society, you refuse me even a flower that your hand has touched." "The last night," said Cecil. Yes, in all probability, the last night. These are no times for featherbed soldiers. We have sailing orders for Japan, and we shall leave London in a few days. And you go to Japan? Naturally. I go where my regiment goes. Are you sorry that I am going? Oh, Cecil, for pity's sake, tell me that you are sorry. I am very sorry. She would have recalled the words the moment they were spoken, but it was too late. The soldier's head bent in the shadow of the curtain, and his hand clasped hers. She drew it away from him indignantly, but she was obliged to repress any overt expression of her indignation, since Florence and Sir Nugent were so very close at hand. I am sorry on my aunt's account, she said. For myself individually, your departure can make very little difference. If your regiment were not ordered to Japan, I suppose it would be sent to Manchester, or Edinburgh, or York, or Dublin. You would be quite as far away at Manchester as you can be in Japan. Do you think the distance between London and Manchester would separate me from you, Cecil? Do you think any distance, the whole width of the world, would divide me from you if— But you talk to me as if I were the most commonplace acquaintance on your visiting list. You have always been cruel to me. Cruel tonight. Cruel at Fortinbras. Cold and cruel. You thought that what you did was for the best, but it was not for the best. And if you had loved me, you could never have done it. I tried to do my duty, but I was never really happy with that poor, devoted girl. I was never really happy with her, though I was heartily sorry for her untimely fate. At the best, I was only resigned. And then I come back to England and find you married to a man who is utterly unsuited to you. Major Gordon, exclaimed Cecil, it is cowardly of you to talk to me like this when you know that I am powerless to answer you. Do you wish me to get up and go away in order to escape from you? All this was said in a half-whisper amidst the crash of the orchestra. Cecil, I have a right to speak to you, the right of the wrong you have done me. My life was in your hands that day at Fortinbras. If you had loved me, surely you would have helped me to escape from the tie that had become so painful to me. A word from you that day would have saved me. I should have written honestly to my poor girl, telling her all the truth, and I know she was too generous to have withheld my release. But you did not love me, and you sent me back to India to do my duty. It is very easy for a woman who does not know what love is to preach eloquently about honor and duty. Major Gordon, if you had loved me, you would not have married so soon after I left England. If you had loved me, you would have been true to my memory a little longer. It is you who are cruel, cried Cecil. She turned to look at him as she spoke. She had been looking towards the stage before, with her face hidden from him, and he saw that her eyes were filled with tears. Cecil, he exclaimed passionately, you have been crying. Tell me that you loved me that day. Confess that you love me, and I will never torment you again. Only tell me that you love me, and I will go away to Japan. You shall never see my face again. You know that I love you. The curtain fell upon Valentine's passionate despair, and there were passion and despair elsewhere than on the mimic scene. Cecil rose suddenly and wrapped her opera cloak round her. Will you send someone to fetch my carriage, Major Gordon? She said. You are not going away, Cecil, cried Flo. There is the party at Mrs. Hetherington's, you know. You promised to go with me. I can't go anywhere else tonight, dear. The heat and the music have made my head ache. That's the worst of Meyerbeer. He's delightful, but he is very apt to make one's head ache. If there could be a fault in an orchestra of Costas, I should think there were too many trombones in the orchestra tonight. And you really can't go to Mrs. Hetherington's. You may order my carriage too, if you please, Sir Nugent. I shan't stop for the last act. The two ladies left the theatre together, escorted by Sir Nugent and the Major. It was Hector who handed Cecil into her brougham, and in bidding her good night, he bent his head over the carriage window and kissed the gloved hand resting in his. God bless you, he said. God bless you, and goodbye. She saw him standing under the portico with uncovered head as her carriage drove away, and she thought that she had heard his voice and seen his face for the last time. How can I ever go home? She said to herself. How can I ever go home and look into my husband's face after what I have listened to tonight? And then she began to wonder if it could indeed be that she had fallen into the dreadful list of false and wicked wives, whose lives are foul secrets to be hidden from the eyes of unsuspecting husbands. She remembered the women whom she had met in society, the women whose sins were suspected but not discovered, the women about and around whom there hovered an impalpable cloud, but who faced the world boldly notwithstanding, secure in the strength of their beauty, or rank, or wit, and defiant of mankind. Lady Cecil had met such women, and had contemplated them with that morbid curiosity which all social mysteries inspire. But tonight she thought of them with a shuddering horror. Shall I ever be ranked among them? She asked herself. Or can I hold myself any better than them henceforward? I have let a man talk to me of his love. I have confessed my own mad folly. But he will go away. Thank God for that. He will go away, and I will try to forget all the folly and wickedness of this year. She sat back in a corner of her carriage with her hands clasped upon her knees. Could there be a stranger picture than this, of a woman seated in her brougham in all her fashionable finery, praying for strength to escape sin? Even as she prayed, the thought that Hector Gordon was indeed going to leave England filled her soul with a dull despair. She was never to see him any more. The sweet intoxication of the bright summertime had come to an end. The brief dream had been succeeded by all the bitterness of the awakening. Why should he have spoken to me as he did tonight, she thought. We were so happy, and if our happiness was sinful, I was unconscious of the sin. After tonight, I can never look upon his face or hear his voice again without deliberate treachery to my husband. During the week succeeding this evening at the opera, Lady Cecil withdrew herself entirely from that frivolous circle in which Mrs. Lobbier reigned supreme. It was in vain that the devoted Florence sent one of the matched footmen to Brunswick Square in a hansom day after day with little perfumed notes of entreaty or reproach. Cecil withdrew herself into her dingy back drawing-room as into a fortress and declined to yield to the advances of the enemy. She pleaded nervous headache and a general disinclination for society, and she implored Mrs. Lobbier not to come to see her, as rest was all she wanted. In a few days I have no doubt I shall be able to come to you, dear. In the meantime, do not trouble yourself about me. I know how many engagements you have, and I beg you to attend to them without thought of me, she wrote, while the matched footman waited in the hall and wondered at the manners and customs of the faithful Pupkin. Such fellers hadn't ought to be allowed to live, said the superb creature in the confidential converse of the servants' hall, which I saw him, while she kept me waiting for her note, washing the glasses in a little hole of a place over the catching leads. And there was boots on a mahogany slab waiting to be took upstairs, which it's my belief he'd cleaned 'em with his own hands. While there's sech fellers as that in the world, you can't wonder if a man gets called a damn lazy beggar for spending a quiet hour over his newspaper. Hector Gordon called twice during the week after that performance of the Huguenots at which he and Cecil had assisted, but the barrister's wife was denied to him on both occasions. There was a little scrawl in pencil on the card which he left for her on the first visit. My regiment leaves on Wednesday. Il faut que je te voie. The inestimable Pupkin brought the card on a salver and handed it solemnly to his mistress. It seemed to her as if he had presented her with a scorpion. She tore the flimsy pasteboard into half a dozen fragments and threw them under the empty grate directly the door had closed upon the servant. He has no right to call here. He has no right to send me messages, she thought indignantly. And yet those two brief sentences, my regiment leaves on Wednesday. Il faut que je te voie, repeated themselves perpetually in her brain, like the scrap of a verse which sometimes haunts one with absurd persistence. On Tuesday, Major Gordon called again, and again left a card with a pencil scrawl for the mistress of the house, and another card for the barrister with P.P.C. in the corner. Tu es bien cruel, he had written on the card intended for Cecil, and again Pupkin handed her the scorpion with all due solemnity, although with by no means the cleanest of hands, having left his blacking brushes to attend the street door. The pencil scrawl and the tu seemed to Cecil a supreme impertinence, but when a woman has confessed to a man that she loves him, he is apt to fancy himself privileged to employ that tender pronoun. Lady Cecil destroyed this card as she had destroyed the first, but she kissed the fragments before she cast them into the grate. She had reached that stage in folly, or perhaps in wickedness, when a woman's soul oscillates like a pendulum between right and wrong. Mr. O'Boynville espied the Major's card in the basket as he took his tea. "Ah, by the by, I saw by the Gazette that your cousin's regiment had the route for Japan," he exclaimed as he examined the slim morsel of pasteboard. "The plungers haven't had much of a holiday after their Indian exploits, and Gordon hasn't dined with us once, after all. I suppose he has all the confounded impudence of your thoroughbred military swell, and would consider he sacrificed himself if he came to such a house as this." The next day was wet and dismal. A wet summer day is the most depressing of all days. Doleful organs alternated selections from the Trovatore with the Old Hundredth, Home, Sweet Home, and I'm Leaving Thee in Sorrow, Annie, with a dreadful emphasis upon the Annie, below the windows of Brunswick Square, as Cecil sat in the drawing-room trying to occupy herself, trying not to think of the transport vessel which was to leave Southampton that day, trying not to remember that it was just possible Hector Gordon might make one last effort to see her before he left England. If he had called in Brunswick Square that day, Cecil would have resolutely refused to see him. And yet, as the day wore on, a dreary feeling took possession of her, which was something like the sense of disappointment. The inevitable dinner hour, the inevitable evening, the disjointed scraps of information out of the Times newspaper, the joke that had convulsed a Westminster audience in the morning, but which sounded so flat and vapid when recorded in the evening, all the petty commonplaces which composed the dull routine of her married life, seemed utterly intolerable to Cecil today. She had lived too much with the butterflies of late. She had feasted on the intoxicating perfumes of the rose garden. And coming back to the hive of the working bee, it was scarcely strange if she found his dwelling dreary and darksome. The day came to an end, the hopeless rain always pattering on the pavements of the square, the organ man always droning his Haché la Morte somewhere or other within hearing. Mr. O'Boynville came home to his substantial commonplace dinner and his after-dinner sleep, and sitting under the dining-room lamp, with an unread novel lying open in her lap, Cecil thought of the transport vessel, which by this time must have left Southampton Water and the green shores of the Wight behind her. "Thank God he is gone," she thought. "Can I ever be thankful enough for that?" Chapter 26. A Modern Love Chase. Mr. O'Boynville was to leave London for his circuit work a week after the departure of the 11th plungers, and again there was a discussion as to the disposal of Cecil's life during his absence. This time she placed herself entirely in her husband's hands. "Perhaps you are right," she said, "and it is better for me not to stay in town while you are away." "Will you go to the Mountjoys? You know how often Mrs. Mountjoy has asked you. I'm sure she'd be pleased if you went." "I think I would rather go to some little watering place where I could have quiet and rest." "Rest?" "Ah, to be sure. I dare say you want rest. You have been going about a good deal this year, and I suppose that sort of thing tires even a woman in the long run. For my own part, I have always found one evening party worse than a week's work, but I'm not a party-going man. You shall go to Scarborough if you like, and I'll try to spend an occasional Sunday with you. I can get across from Manchester and Liverpool." "I should like that very much." "Then it shall be so." But it was not so, for a little note came from Mrs. Lobyer in the course of the morning to say that that lady was coming to dine in the evening, unless her heartless Cecil told her she was not to come. "I know you are at home," wrote the lively Florence, "and I know your nervous headache is only an excuse for shutting your doors upon me, so I shall make a desperate attempt to force the citadel." Cecil had no motive for excluding her friend. There was only one person whom she had wished to avoid, and that person had now left England. "Come to us by all means, dearest Flo," she wrote, "if you don't mind a dull evening." So at 6:30, Florence's unapproachable chestnuts poured the macadam of Bloomsbury, and the barrister's dinner was enlivened by that young lady's vivacious chatter. "I have come to make a petition," she said, "and it is to you I shall address myself, Mr. O'Boynville. I have grown heartily tired of London within this last week or two. I think the Ascot week is the season's apogee, and after that everything begins to fade. There are to be cheap nights at the opera next week, and how can any decent person stay in town when there are cheap nights at the opera? So I am going to rush off to Pevenshaw the day after tomorrow, and I want Cecil to go with me. I know your circuit work begins next week, Mr. O'Boynville, and I don't intend to accept a refusal. You can come to us from some of your northern towns whenever you please, and we shall always be glad to have a flying visit. It was in vain that Cecil told her friend of the plan that had already been made for Scarborough. Mrs. Lobyer pooh-poohed Scarborough. Cecil urged her desire for perfect rest and quiet, but Mrs. Lobyer declared that Pevenshaw would be a perfect hermitage during the month of July. None of my people are coming till the 12th of August, she said. It is impossible to beguile a decent man into the country till there is something for him to shoot. Sir Nugent is yachting in some uncivilized northern region, and Grace Evershed is going to Switzerland with her father. Mr. Wilmot, that young clubbish man you know, who played so well in our comedy, is going on a walking expedition in Brittany, and in fact every body worth having is engaged between this and September. So, if you want quiet, Cecil, you shall have plenty of it at Pevenshaw. I have secured the dearest and deafest of matrons to play propriety, a delightful old creature who dozes in a snug corner half the day and deludes herself with the belief that she is doing Berlin wool work, so we can live our own lives and enjoy ourselves thoroughly. I am going to try and do something for the good of my fellow creatures this year, and I shall want your advice about some schools I wish to establish and some cottages I mean to build near Pevenshaw. Mrs. Lobyer was in the habit of pleading as earnestly as a spoiled child for the gratification of her wishes, and on this occasion, as on almost every other, she contrived to have her own way. It was arranged that Cecil should go to Pevenshaw, and that she and Flo should travel together. Cecil was busy with her packing next day when a card was put into her hand, and she was told that a gentleman was waiting for her in the drawing-room. "A gentleman for me?" she said, without looking at the card. "Yes, my lady. The same gentleman who called twice before, Pupkin says." Cecil looked at the card and saw that it was Hector Gordon's, but over the inscription in the corner, 11th Plungers, the words "late of" were written in pencil. "I cannot see Major Gordon," said Cecil. "Tell Pupkin to say that I am particularly engaged." The servant stared, but obeyed. When the door had closed upon her, Cecil sat with the card in her hand, staring blankly at that half-written, half-printed sentence, "late of the 11th Plungers." "He has not gone," she said to herself, "and he has left his regiment. What does it all mean?" Something like actual fear took possession of her as she thought that Hector Gordon was in England, near her, ready at any moment to intrude his presence upon her. "He has betrayed me," she said. "He made me believe that he was going away on purpose to extort my secret from me. And now he will come, and come, and come, until at last he forces me to see him. And then nothing but misery can come of our meeting, nothing but wretchedness and remorse." And then her mind went back to that subject of which she had thought as she drove home from the opera. The images of women whom she knew and had known arose before her, the women who hovered on the borderland between the Eden of respectability and the region of outer darkness far away. She began to understand the stories of many of these women, the stories which had been such dark enigmas for her until today. They have been like me, perhaps, she thought. They have believed in their own strength of mind, their own honor, and all at once they have sunk into a degradation as deep as mine. And my husband leaves me to my fate, to take my own course, without help or care from him. I doubt if he remembers my existence, except when I am with him, and I know he is often unconscious of my presence, even when I am sitting by his side. For the first time in her life, Cecil felt a sense of resentment as she thought of her husband's indifference. He was kind, he was generous. She tried to remember this and to be grateful, but today she could remember only his indifference. She had long ago reconciled herself to the idea that he loved his profession better than he loved his wife, but today she was angry with him for the unflattering preference, and argued that he must love his wife very little if the dry-as-dust work of the law courts could be dearer to him than she was. Today, for the first time, she was angry with him for not loving her better, for today she felt herself in supreme need of his love. She went on with her packing, mechanically enough, but still the work was done. The housemaid, who assisted in the process, thought her mistress just a little paler and a little quieter than usual, and was rather inclined to wonder about that military gentleman who had called 3 times and had been refused admittance every time, and who, according to Pupkin, was such a splendid and gracious creature. "He's never been here except those 3 times," thought the housemaid. Perhaps she knew him before she was married to Master, poor thing. When the packing was finished, Cecil ordered her brougham and drove to Dorset Square. She was feverishly anxious to know the meaning of those 2 words, "late of," on Hector Gordon's card. She found her aunt at home, but that lady could throw no light upon the mystery. "I fully thought he had sailed for Japan in the satrap," said the dowager. "He came to bid me good-bye a week ago, and he didn't say a word then about the probability of his exchanging or selling out. I don't read the Military Gazette. He might have called upon me, I think, to tell me the change in his plans, but he has been very mysterious in his manners of late. Perhaps he has seen someone who is to be the second Mrs. Gordon. Those young men with too much money and nothing to do are always falling in love." Cecil could obtain no more than this from the dowager. She bade her aunt good-bye and went back to Brunswick Square, where she received a little note from Mr. O'Boinville, announcing that he found himself suddenly compelled to dine at Blackwall with Sleghammer and 2 or 3 others. So she was left alone all the evening, too preoccupied to read, and with nothing to do but to sit in the summer twilight listening to the fifes and drums in the quadrangle of the Foundling and the ebb and flow of hansom cabs. The train by which Mrs. Lobbyer was to travel left the Euston station at 10 o'clock. There had been some talk of Mr. Lobbyer accompanying his wife, but on the eve of the journey that gentleman announced the necessity of his immediate departure for Rouen to complete some great cotton transaction involving considerable strategy and the mystification of the calico trade in general for the enrichment of Lobbyer and Company in particular. "It's a fluke," said the ardent young speculator, "and it's just one of those affairs in which half an hour on the right or the wrong side may make a difference of 2 or 3 thousand pounds. You can send what servants you like to Pevenshall, and if I am obliged to stop in town when I come back, I can use my club." Cecil found Flo in the waiting-room with her maid in attendance, while one of the matched footmen stood on guard at the door, holding a box of books by a strap and evidently suffering from an acute sense of ill usage. This dignified person was employed to secure a carriage for the 2 ladies, and after ushering them to their seats, retired to a second-class compartment with the maid. Of course, it was the fastest of express trains. Such people as Mrs. Lobbyer rarely consent to travel at less than 60 miles an hour. Whirling northwards across the bright green country with the lively Flo for her companion, Cecil felt as if she had been escaping from danger and unhappiness. Major Gordon might call again in Brunswick Square, but he would find her gone and would abandon his persecution of her. "It is persecution," she thought, "after the circumstances of that night at the opera. He entrapped me into a confession, and he will be worse than a traitor if he uses my guilty weakness against me." She tried to despise him for the dishonor, but even the dishonor was a sacrifice which he made to his love. "My husband will not waste an hour from his profession for my sake," she thought, "and this man, who was once so true and honorable, is ready to sacrifice truth and honor for love of me." She thought this, not in set phrases, as it is written here, but some such thought floated vaguely in her brain as the express carried her towards Pevenshall. The rooms Cecil had occupied in the winter had been made ready for her now, bright and gay with birds and flowers today, as they had been bright with lights and fire of old. Flo sent a useful young person who did plain needlework and waited upon maidless visitors to assist in her friend's unpacking. And aided by this young person, Cecil dressed for dinner and found leisure to sit by the open window of her little sitting-room, looking out at the broad expanse of hill and valley that stretched beyond the gardens. She was roused from her reverie by Mrs. Lobbyer, who came tripping into the room with more than customary animation. "I have come to tell you some good news," she said. perching herself upon the arm of Cecil's chair like something frivolous and fashionable in the 1800s way of birds. That mauve and white grenadine becomes you admirably, and I like the sash worn across the shoulder that way, like the Queen's blue ribbon. What darling cameo earrings. If there is anything in the world I adore, it is cameos. Is that your news, Flo? Oh no, my news is something better than that. I was dying to tell you all the time we were travelling, but I was determined to reserve it for a bonne bouche. And now, shall I give it you in 10? Shall I give it you in 20? Shall I give it you in one of Mr. Lobbier's billions? I have secured an eligible male visitor. Cecil shrugged her shoulders. I thought we were going to seclude ourselves from the world in order to carry out some philanthropic schemes, Flo. Oh, the philanthropic schemes shall go on all the same. Saira. But Pevenshaw entirely given over to the curates of the neighbourhood, and 2 or 3 narrow-minded county squires would have been insufferably dull. And then this gentleman is a friend of yours. What gentleman? Major Gordon. He has been wise enough to sell out just as his regiment was going to sail for Japan. He called on me yesterday, and I told him you were coming with me, and I made Mr. Lobbier ask him to come to us. He accepted the invitation immediately, and it was all arranged on the spot. This was before Mr. Lobbier knew that he would be obliged to go to Rouen, but if he had known that, I don't suppose it would have made much difference. I am blessed with the least jealous of husbands. Flo, is it wicked to say that? Mustn't I thank Providence for my blessings? And Major Gordon is really coming. Really and truly. He's here by this time, I dare say. There is a fast train that leaves London at 12:30. And now come and let me introduce you to my deaf darling, Mrs. Henniker. Why, child, you stand there with your eyes fixed as if you were in a trance, and the second dinner bell has rung. Filans,